Hey guys, welcome back to the exam preparation for the Burp Suite Certified Practitioner. And this section is the 7 golden tips for the Burp exam, right? And this is based on my own experience as well as information you get from the Portswigger website. So number one, and this is, I think a lot of guys don't know that, you should read all the documentation on the Portswigger website regarding to the exam, right? But I heard from many people they didn't know that, and so this is why I want to highlight and stress it here. So there is 3 stages. You have 2 applications, and each application has 3 stages. Stage number 1 for you, what you need to do first is access any user account other than yours. So you might be given one, but that's not the point. You need to access another user, right? So like say Carlos, for example, right? So you need to access the account of Carlos. How you achieve that, I don't know, right? Because this is dependent on the vulnerability they present you for that. But that's step number 1. And then once you have logged in with that specific user, right? Then you basically try to get to the /admin panel, and this will fail, right? Like you might be able to see the admin panel now, or you might be able to browse to it, but you still cannot do any action there because you're not an administrator. So that means privilege escalation. So you either need to find um, a privilege escalation bug where you can make Carlos an administrator. That's one way. Or the other way would be to find, like, using something like a vulnerability to basically get the credentials of the administrator, right? And then once you have achieved that, only then you try to read a home Carlos secret. So this is very, very important. You have to do this in order, right? Like if you start out and try to hack around and try to get to home Carlos secret, it's pointless, right? You need to be administrator first. And then there's another bug you need to exploit in order to read this out, right? So it's very important. So don't even bother looking at anything else before you have access to another user's account. And then don't even bother of reading anything once you have the, say, Carlos account. No, then you need to get to administrator level. And only when you are at administrator level, then you actually start trying to find a way to read that secret. And by the way, that home Carlos secret is the solution for the lab. Like that's the final solution you need to submit. Okay, so it's also very important that you need Burp Pro for this. So if you do an exam, if you do the exam, you need Burp Pro, not the Community Edition. Why? Because it has an inbuilt collaboration server, and you need that collaboration server for blind data exfiltration jobs, right? So it's unfortunate a bit, but you need a Pro license. Now, what I mean is it doesn't necessarily have to be a license in your account. So, for example, I have access to a corporate license, right, which is not in my account, but I was doing the exam through my account. So it doesn't really matter where the license is registered. What matters is that you have a Burp Pro installation locally on your laptop with a license. And it doesn't have to be your license, can be a corporate license, whatever, can be registered under a different domain or whatever. It doesn't really matter, right? But it's important that you have access to a Burp Pro machine. And also important, you don't need to brute force. You don't need to brute force or fuzz folders or files and stuff. Everything springs to mind. Like the admin path, you need to remember, right? Like the /admin, and but everything will show up easily in Burp Suite in your basically structure tree on the left hand side, what you need. So it's not like that you need to brute force around and fuss, or there's weird names and things like that. So when we talk about the stages, remember, compromising another regular user. So these are all the vulnerability classes which are potentially important in stage 1. So cross-site scripting, C-serve attacks, click checking, DOM-based cores, HTTP request smuggling, access control issues, authentication, web cache, poisoning, host header attacks, OAuth flows, or short. So those are really the only ones which are applicable in the first stage, right? So this is very important to keep in mind, because you're not supposed to look at other vulnerability classes which are not listed here for stage 1. You might need them later, right? So to become an admin or to do privilege escalations, it could be any of those, right? So it could be, for example, SQL injection. But the SQL injection only works for Carlos's account, for example, or you need a cookie from Carlos in order to pull off that SQL injection. This is just one example, right? And yeah, so again, I suggest print those out and have them ready, or have them in the PDF, which I supply you, and have them ready on exam day, so that you limit your scope, what you're doing. And once you have the Carlos accounts, I'm always using Carlos, but it's most likely Carlos, because even Portswigger says on the website, there's always a Carlos account. And so you need to compromise Carlos, basically, right? And then once you compromise Carlos and you're logged in as Carlos, then you look at this. Then you look at how can I become an admin? And then you think back of all the labs you have done where we escalated privileges and things like that, right? Like how can I then become an administrator or administrative rights? And then in step 3, you have a much smaller amount of potential options, right? Like, so now we are administrator, or we compromise an administrator account, or we have administrative rights. And then in order to read this file, right, like what could I use? Like SQL injection, XXE, for example, and SSRF, for example, OS command injection, server-side template injection, or simple directory traversal, insecure deserialization, because now maybe as an administrator I have another cookie and I got a deserialized object, or there's a file upload functionality now present which wasn't present before as a Carlos user, but now as an administrator user I can all of a sudden upload a file or something like this, right? Like, so just follow these steps, because it's really important that you don't just hack around and try things out, and because you get lost, and you need to follow stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. And once you're done, you're not really done, because then you do the second application, right? So remember, the exam is 4 hours long, and you can theoretically spend 3 hours and 55 minutes on the first application and then just 5 minutes on the second application, but it's most likely not going to work out. So you should budget your time as well, right? Like you have the first application and you should do it roughly in 2 hours. If you run over, you run over. It's fine, right? But you should not really, hack for 3.5 hours on the first application and then start with the second one in the last 30 minutes. It doesn't work like that. So you should balance your time roughly 2 hours and 2 hours. And in order to solve 6 vulnerabilities, you need 6 vulnerability exploitations to pass the exam. So 3 in the first app and 3 in the second app. Okay, exploitation. So Portswigger explicitly mentions an XSS pop-up is not enough. All their labs, or the majority of their labs, right, in the apprentice and practitioner sections are like pop-up or print or stuff, right? Like something not useful, really. In the exam, you need to exfiltrate a cookie, or you need to create impact, right? So if you think of stage 1, you need to pull off an XSS attack to steal Carlos's token, right? Or his session cookie, effectively, right? So this is very important. And the same goes for SQL injection. The sleep command is not just enough. That's enough for bug bounty. But here you need to actually exfiltrate stuff. Like you need to exfiltrate the table, and like you need to look into columns, and you might need to dump the database, and you need to be proficient with SQL map, right? Like, so I use SQL map. I also use SQL map in the exam, right? So I as you know from the labs, you can solve a lot of the labs with intruder and things like that, but it's too time consuming. You don't have that time for the exam. So get proficient with SQL Map, and you need Kali or something similar available locally. Run this on a VM or, like on a Raspberry Pi or somewhere in the cloud or something. But you need to have like a Linux CLI environment. And you also have an exploit server in the exam, similar to the exploit server you have in some of the labs, but that exploit server will always be there. Now, very important, have your payloads ready. And I was long thinking whether I should give you all these payloads, and I said no, because this is a very good learning curve for you guys to create your own payloads. What I mean with those payloads is basically when you had a lab, right? Like, for example, you take one of the basic cross-site scripting labs and things like that, where there is an exploit, an alert document cookie or alert zero or whatever is hosted on the exploit server. You have to rework that specific exploit, which was either in a script tag or in an iframe or something like this. You have to rework this, right? And put a payload in there which exfiltrates the cookie for XSS. That's so important, right? Like, this is so important, and you need to have those in a text file and ready to go so that you can just search through it during the exam and then hammer that payload in. Because building those is doable, I agree, and it depends how quick you are with building payloads. This is doable during the exam, but in my opinion, you need to have those ready and just modify them to your needs, right? So this is important. So when I say exploit templates, go through all the XSS payloads. Generally speaking, any payload in the Burp Practitioner and Apprentice labs which were in a script tag or in an iframe from all the labs, you need to rework them in order to have them ready for the exam. So that's mainly like the first two is for cross-site scripting to exfiltrate your cookie, right? Or exfiltrate the cookie of the user. You need to have the click checking to trigger DOM XSS payload ready. You need to have the request smuggling to perform XSS payload ready, right? You need to have that payload ready where in the authentication lab where you steal a cookie of another user who visits a blog. You need to have that ready. You need to have the web cache poisoning payload ready for XSS. Like this is like the location equals. So and then the CSRF payloads, all the CSRF payloads for the same site exploits. The cause payload for the exploit server, there's only one, I believe. All XSE payloads listed underneath with a short explanation what they do, right? All the OAuth payloads in order to complete the flow and stuff like that, and like to exfiltrate a token out and things like that. You need the WebSocket hijacking payload ready, and basically all of these. So this is the list, and this is a good practice, and this is a very good exercise to understand this and actually try it in the lab. Try it out in those specific labs respectively and change it from alert zero or from print zero to actually exfiltrate it, say, to your Burp collaborator or to the exploit server, right? And then know how to do that. That's very, very important for the exam. Now, on SQL injection, these two commands should be sufficient, right? Like for this, so I've taken those from SQL injection labs on Portstrigger, but it's basically SQL map -u and then the URL and then the category pets followed by the tick to inflict SQL injection, and then don't forget the -- cookie, and that cookie obviously needs to match your session from your lab, like from your lab or from your exam. And then -- level 2. So this is like the first one. And then this will basically tell you which database version it is and stuff like that. And then you can, if you then find out, hey, it's DBMS, Postgres, or Oracle, or whatever, then you can do it like this, and then -- dump, -- threads 5, for example, right? Like, I mean, this is just an example, but that helps you to solve the SQL injection lab. So you really need to have a Linux CLI as well. Cross-site scripting. So the ones I mentioned earlier to you, this is how they should look like, right? Like for example, instead of a script alert 0, you have a script document location and then your exploit server where you then basically exfiltrate the cookie, right? The second one is a funny one because I wanted to try if this is working, and it actually is. So I leave the alert 0 in there and then put the fetch afterwards, like as a second command. And then basically I exfiltrate the cookie to my collaboration server, right? Like to my collaboration server. And this is how your payload should look like. And that when you're in the exam and you encounter cross-site scripting vulnerability, you don't have to look up, hey, how do I exfiltrate a cookie, or how do I do this, or how do I do that? You need them ready, copy paste, because believe me, you will run short on time. I ran short on time, and this is important. And I didn't do a good job on this when I did the exam because I didn't have everything ready, like I'm telling you now, and this is why I barely made it, right? Like, so I spent 3 hours and 50 minutes, I think, and it was close. It was 9 minutes and something was left when I actually finished the exam. So in order to cut that down, you really should have your exploits ready. So that's tip number 3. Tip number 4, we talked about this in the previous chapter already, is the specific scans. So you find an interesting functionality, then you can do a specific scan on just that functionality rather than doing a full scan on the application. I don't know how Portswigger does it, but if you kick one off, it will run forever, right? And it will not give you meaningful results. However, if you look at a specific request and then just scan this endpoint, you get good results usually. And the Portswigger scanner is powerful. The Burp scanner is powerful. You can also define your own scanning profiles and things like that. But for the exam, you don't need that. For the exam, you just scan that specific request or a specific insertion point. If you want to like try payloads on a specific parameter and things like that. This is all described very neatly here in those 3, including the encodings. Number 5, have your cheat sheets ready from Portswigger. The first one is the cross-site scripting cheat sheet. You need that, right? You totally need this because you might stumble across a lab where you need to brute force the tags which are being allowed, or the event handlers which are being allowed and stuff like that. So you have that ready. Same goes for SQLi. Although I use SQL Map, sometimes you cannot mimic everything with SQL Map easily, right? So, for example, if the SQL injection might be in the cookie or something, then and you have a thought in mind that there might be a specific vulnerability, then check again on the cheat sheet, on the SQL injection cheat sheet, like what you could use in that specific scenario, especially when you know what database you're up against, and it helps you. Yeah, trust me. Usernames and passwords. So if there is a brute forcing at some point, or you need to brute force something, those are the lists, right? Like those are the lists, and I'm not saying that this is working, right? Like, so a guy actually asked me, like, hey, when you need to get an administrator account, can you just brute force it? It's like use the username administrator and then brute force the passwords, and it does not work, right? Like, so basically the administrator password is not in there. So you need to get it by other means. Okay, like as other vulnerability classes. But there might be, and Portswigger keeps this open. They say on the website, like, if you need usernames and passwords, if there's like something to brute force, use those lists. So make sure you have them ready. Now, on Linux, what you need is SQL Map, NoSQL Map, YSO serial, which is for insecure deserialization of Java, and the jaw tool, right? So the jaw tool, I like the jaw tool because the jaw tool is very good for brute forcing keys, for example. You can do a lot more with it, but I tend to use Chart Editor. in Burp. But if you want to brute force something quick, and the key will be weak. So I'm telling you, like, if there is a vulnerability around short, the key will be weak. The key will not be like super complex or something. So you can use like a default word list or something. But have Linux ready and use VirtualBox or something free, or a little Raspberry, or any of that. But have those 4 tools installed for the exam. Now, also I recommend to install these Burp extensions. So the reflector extension is optional. I like it. I always have it on. This is basically showing you where your input is being reflected, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's a cross-site scripting vulnerability, but it's a hint that you might want to investigate this further, right? And use or install the flow and the HTTP request smuggler. So those two for any HTTP request smuggling, because doing this manually is a pain. Trust me. You want to have those two, and you want to read them up on GitHub, like how to use them, and because they make life a lot easier. To be fair, in my career, I've only found one HTTP request smuggling vulnerability to date, but they exist. They are out there, and so just keep that in mind. I always have Hackverter installed. This is a super powerful tool for encoding, decoding on the fly, right? Like entity encoding and stuff like that, or any kind of encoding really. And you can do this on the fly. So I always have that installed. I have InQL always installed, but that's just for GraphQL to be able to deal with the queries in a nicer format. The Java deserialization scanner can be super helpful for detecting insecure deserialization. Now, this is more real world. In the exam, if there is a deserialized Java object, chances are there's something wrong with it, right? Like this, I shouldn't say that, but because it's not a good way to approach things in the real world. But in order to go on about the exam, if there's a functionality, there might be a bug. That's all I can say around this, right? But in the real world, obviously, you would use like a Java deserialization scanner on the object and stuff to see if it's actually vulnerable. And then the chart editor and the JSON Web Tokens are two fantastic extensions for dealing with JSON Web Tokens and all kinds of attacks, right? Like you might have used them already when you did the chart section of the Burp labs, but they're really good. And then one of my favorites, absolute favorites, is Paraminer, which is incredibly helpful to guess parameters, to guess headers and stuff like that, and incredibly useful for web cache poisoning and for host header attacks. Like when you don't know which hosts are being, or host headers are being supported, and you are attempting any of these web cache poisoning or host header attacks, then you scan it basically, and then it tells you, hey, it supports X forwarded URL or what X host or whatever, right? So really powerful. And then last but not least, Turbo Intruder, which is incredibly useful for brute forcing in the real world, particularly because it's so much more powerful than Burp's inbuilt intruder. But for race conditions, it's a tool you must have, right? Like because it has built-in scripts for race conditions already, and you can utilize them and you can modify the code super easily, and this is really useful for race conditions. And then finally, in the tools section, there is this link, which is CyberChef. CyberChef is basically like an encoding, decoding tool online. Whenever you stumble across a blob online, something, you can put it in there, and then it gives you basically, it tries to decode it. Or you can encode things, you can triple encode, double encode, make changes to it, all these kind of things, right? Like you have an inbuilt one in Burp, like the decoder, but this is so much nicer. And one word of caution for the exam, use this. In the real world, get your own GitHub repo, download it locally and do it there, because you don't want to upload to them. You don't want to upload to them any user tokens or something like this, because that could be confidential information, right? So if you do a real world engagement, spin it up on a local machine or something, and then, but for the exam, perfectly fine to put anything in there. More tips. So there's always an administrator account, okay? And it's called administrator, right? So very simple. Botswigger states that clearly. There's always an administrator account, and you need that. You need that in step 2. There's always a Carlos account as well. And then the app has always one active user, either administrator or Carlos, which visits the homepage every 15 seconds, right? Like think of web cache poisoning and stuff like that, and will click any link which this guy, Carlos, or the administrator will get presented. So in the exploit server, you have delivered to victim, right? Like CSRF attacks and whatnot. And so you have that possibility here as well. So just be aware of that this will be clicked, it will be executed somewhere. And then if there's a CSRF, or if not CSRF, if there's an SSRF, or if you find an SSRF, like a URL input or something, there is basically SSRF will run on a localhost port 6566, right? Like just so you know, if you try to find an SSRF vulnerability and you enter localhost and then on port 6566, then this should respond. So there's no need to brute force around like other subnets and stuff like that. So if there is one which is specific to SSRF, it's on localhost and that port. Now, also important, don't look at the _lab and _lab_analytics cookies. So there's no need to analyze them. There's no need to change them. There's no need to try SQL injection. There's no need to try anything with them, because they are needed for the exam by Portswinger. They are not your business. So anything else is fair game and is good to go, but don't waste any time at those, because they are not relevant to the actual to your exam. They are just for tracking purposes and whatnot. Okay, thank you very much. That finishes up our theoretical portion, and now let's go through the labs together. Thank you.